Ok, olá, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Muito obrigado por se juntarem a nós neste dia, enfim, com condições climatéricas adversas em Coimbra e noutros pontos do país. Boa tarde também para quem nos está a seguir no YouTube. E com a vossa licença, muda então para inglês, enfim, que vai ser a linguagem da sessão. So, as I was saying, welcome. And apologies for the slight delay in starting this session. We are experiencing some difficulties here in Coimbra due to the bad weather conditions. Having said this, it's a pleasure to open once again this session for the third and final workshop of Professor DOMINIC McIVER LOPES here with us in Coimbra during this month of January. So for those who have been following these workshops, Professor DOMINIC McIVER LOPES, who is of course one of the leading international specialists in the field of aesthetics, philosophical aesthetics in connection with artistic studies, is a Gulbenkian visiting professor with us here at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Coimbra. And he's been working on several interconnected themes, such as the theories of aesthetic value, what is aesthetic value, such as the applications of these issues to matters of injustice. For instance, he gave a second workshop on the notion of aesthetic injustice, which is one of his original developments. And now is actually following the publication of other previous books, such as Being for Beauty, for instance, and what he calls his network theory. He is working on a notion of aesthetic pluralism. And so actually, one of the other things that we've been doing here during this month of January with him is a reading group on his next book, which is precisely called Aesthetic Pluralism, Episodes in the History of Aesthetics. And this is the topic I think he's going to talk to us about in this third workshop, which has as its general topic aesthetic pluralism, historical approach. As you will see, Professor McIVER LOPES is a value pluralist, is also a liberal, I would say. He cherishes deeply the value of diversity, something we were talking about also with Professor Lautaro Lanzillotta, our other Gulbenkian professor who is with us here today. And so, yeah, I'll shut up, but let me remind you the format of these sessions, because Professor McIVER LOPES, Dom, as he likes to be called in the inner circle, he doesn't like to give like lengthy talks. And so actually the format is we'll have a first presentation, more or less. Is that it, Dom?
I'm going to mix it up a bit.
Okay, so I'm not going to tell you anything about the presentation. I'll let Dom surprise you. But we'll be here for 2 hours, more or less. And I'll be sharing the moments of discussion, I guess. I'm Gonçalo Marcelo, by the way, for those of you who don't know me. But now I'll stop and I'll let Dom conduct the session. This time around, we have no PowerPoint, just the handout for those who are here with us in the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Yes, on format, I believe that form should follow function. And so I was thinking about what the point of today is, and I realized that I wanted to change the standard format. So what's the point of today? Well, this is the concluding of 3 workshops in which I've been presenting, taking a theoretical approach to aesthetics, centered on the concept of aesthetic pluralism. And it's also comes on the heels of the last session of a reading group that has been running in parallel with the workshops. And in that reading group, some valiant and brave colleagues here read some 3 drafts of chapters of a book that I'm writing in the history of aesthetics with a focus on pluralism. And so I wanted to bring these 2 parallel events together today. And I wanted to think out loud a bit. So in the workshop, the first workshop, I presented some of the main ideas of this book that I published in 2018 called Being for Beauty. And Being for Beauty presents a theory of aesthetic value. It thinks of aesthetic values as providing a vocabulary within which people can cooperate with each other in order to boost their own chances of individual achievement in aesthetic practices. And this theory of aesthetic value implies aesthetic pluralism. What that is, we'll come to in a moment, but it implies it. And it also, in implying pluralism, opens up space for something that I call respect. And I'll say more about that later on. In the second workshop, I presented the main ideas of this book that I wrote, came out last year, Aesthetic Injustice. And in Aesthetic Injustice, I use the concept of pluralism and respect to make a case that we have certain kinds of interests that we have until now been only vaguely aware of. These are interests in the supporting, boosting the diversity of aesthetic cultures and their autonomy. That is to say, I think that each of us has an interest in boosting other people's aesthetic cultures that are not our own. So pluralism plus respect gives us these interests. I call them cosmopolitan interests because they echo the thinking of certain kinds of cosmopolitans, especially Anthony Appiah in the United States. So those are the first two workshops, and you'll notice that there I was packaging for this audience some existing work. And today I'm not really going to do that. Instead, I want to take that train of thought that's in the first two workshops and develop it further by looking more closely at what aesthetic value pluralism is, but also tying that into the historical project that I'm working on at the moment. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what aesthetic pluralism really is, and then I'm going to present you with a case study. I realized that I'm here at the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies, and so I thought something classical would be good, but I have presented one of the chapters that we talked about was on Plato, but I thought classical but maybe not European would be fun. And I bet that Chinese philosophy is not very much studied here. Anybody familiar with much Chinese philosophy? And so I thought you might enjoy a little taste of it. So I'm going to talk about the main ideas of the chapter in the book that will be on the Zhuangzi. Don't worry, I'm going to make it all very approachable to you. It'll be kind of fun. So the first half, general philosophical theory, and the second half, looking at the Zhuangzi. All of the texts that we read in the reading group were monists. Zhuangzi is a pluralist. So I wanted to give those of you who've been in the reading group a taste of a pluralist. All right, so that's the form, that's the function. What should the form be? I was kind of hoping for something like a work in progress seminar. So in my department, we present our work to each other. And this is the standard format, never a written paper, always a handout. And somebody starts talking through their handout and immediately they're interrupted. And then there's like a 10-minute conversation about that one line in the handout. And then we move on, and we get interrupted again. So I'm hoping you will accept an invitation to stop me at every point along the way. Every point along the way that provokes you, that gets you thinking, that you maybe have something to say about. And we can just have a little conversation about that. So first half of the handout is the kind of the theoretical stuff, and then the back is the Zhuangzi. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Okay. It occurred to me for several reasons that I need to spend more time thinking about what exactly monism, aesthetic value monism, and aesthetic value pluralism actually are. I began by developing a conception of pluralism out of the theoretical work on aesthetic value. It's being for beauty and aesthetic injustice. They imply a conception of pluralism. That doesn't mean that that conception of the pluralism is the same one that's animating the thinking of historical figures. They might have something different in mind. And as I've been reading and writing up the chapters in the book, I've been asking myself, is the conception that I began with, that comes out of my own work, the one that Plato has in mind, that Shaftesbury has in mind, that Hegel has in mind, that Zhuangzi has in mind? So I began to worry about that. I especially began to worry because I begin with pluralism and I take monism to be the antithesis of it. But historically, monism is dominant, hugely dominant. It's the privileged position. And you have to actually work kind of hard to find pluralists. And so I worry that perhaps my conception of pluralism isn't their conception of pluralism. Another thing is that it could be that monists have a conception of pluralism that is different from the conception of pluralism that pluralists have. This often happens in philosophy. We talk past each other. A monist says, oh, we better be monists because pluralism is this, and look how terrible that is. And pluralists say, no, we should be pluralists. Here's our vision. Isn't that wonderful? And it turns out that they're actually talking about different things. So this is quite common. And it recommends caution. And so as I've been reading these texts and writing about them, when you write about a text, you really are reading it properly for the first time, right? So I've been like reading them properly for the first time by writing about them and been thinking, well, really is Plato's worry about pluralism a worry about pluralism in my sense, or is it something else? So I want to think out loud for you guys about how to think about that. Also, last reason to reopen the question, what's the best way to think about aesthetic value, monism, and pluralism, is that it turns out some of my contemporaries have been writing reviews or critical notices of aesthetic injustice, and they've been saying, no, this is not the right way to think about pluralism. They've been disagreeing with me. And so there's a contemporary reason to rethink things. It could be that there's a contemporary, so here's one possibility. The monists and pluralists see monism and pluralism differently in the historical record. Another possibility that we need to be concerned about is the possibility that contemporary pluralists and historical pluralists understand pluralism differently. And maybe I'm out of sync with the history, or maybe my colleagues, my critics, are out of sync with the history. We've got to figure that out. Okay, so that's where this question is coming from. So I'm just going to step through how I've been thinking about monism and pluralism and try to articulate better than I have in the past in either of these books or in the manuscript that I'm writing, what I think these positions are, and then point out what I think is maybe the big question mark, where there could be competing visions of pluralism. So maybe it's useful to note that there are actually three possible positions. The first, you could say, is nihilism. So nihilism says that there are no fundamental aesthetic values. That implies that there are just no aesthetic values at all. So what do I mean by fundamental values? So suppose you think that the skippiness of a song is a value that it has. Or suppose you think the cleverness of an argument is a value and is an aesthetic value in the argument. Then you will very quickly realize that there are lots of different kinds of aesthetic values. A meal can be comforting. A drink can be exotic. A painting can be shocking. These are all aesthetic values. Right? And you might think that they are grounded in more general values. So you might think that there's one aesthetic value and it's manifest in many different ways, or you might think that there are many aesthetic values, you might think that there are none. So that's what I mean by fundamental. So nihilism says there are no aesthetic values, so there can be no more fundamental value that's responsible for those more specific values. For example, pleasure. So some philosophers have argued that aesthetic values reduce to pleasures. Pleasure, that might be the fundamental value, and a nihilist would say, no, 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 there is no aesthetic value, so there's no fundamental aesthetic value. Monists and pluralists all think nihilists are wrong. They all think there is such a thing as aesthetic value, and they disagree really about how many there are at the fundamental level. They agree about how many there are at the non-fundamental level. So everybody thinks the answer to the question, how many aesthetic values are there, is zillions. There are lots of, every poem has a value of its own that you maybe will take a lot of writing to express and identify, right? There are lots of those values. The monists say, but they all come down to one. Maybe pleasure, or maybe beauty is the one, or like there are lots of proposals out there. So monists think there's one fundamental value. This claim that there's a fundamental value, it's kind of formal and empty. Taken by itself, what is it doing for us? Like, philosophers are not accountants. We're not in the business of putting numbers in columns. So if we have a number in a column, fundamental value, one or many, or zero, it's got to be because putting that number in the column is doing something for us. So monism, which says that there's one fundamental value, take that by itself and you just have an empty formalism. The point of that claim, there's just one fundamental value, has got to be that it enables us to see that aesthetic values have some other features that are more interesting. Okay, so one is, if there's one fundamental value, then all the values have universal validity. What that means is, all the values that give me reason to act, give you reason to act, give you reason to act, give you reason, they give us all the same reason to act. So the poster child of universal validity in philosophy is Kant's third critique. Kant says, if I think that something is beautiful, if I judge it to be beautiful, then I judge that you must also judge it to be beautiful. What's valid for me has got to be universally valid. Valid there means, for me, reason giving. Gives you reason to appreciate, for instance, or to create, or to do something. So one payoff of the claim that monism, that there's one fundamental aesthetic value is that one fundamental aesthetic value makes all of the other superficial values universally reason-giving. A reason for one is a reason for all. This is attractive. Like for Kant, it makes us all members of the community of humankind. And that's nothing to snigger at. That's a beautiful vision. Okay, here's another payoff, I think, that's pretty clearly accepted by monists. The values are comparable. That means because the superficial values are grounded in a fundamental value, each of those values can be compared. It's either the case that one is better than the other or they're equal in value. One is better than the other, A is better than B, or B is better than A, or A and B are equal in value. So that's comparability. And another idea that's in the vicinity here is that of compatibility. And here, compatibility is the thing that's worrying me. So let me go back to a passage of Plato. This is from the Protagoras that I quote in the first chapter of this manuscript. So this is the first passage halfway down the first page. And I've bolded the key phrases. So Plato has Socrates say, while the power of appearance often makes us wander all over the place in confusion, there's nothing worse for Socrates, often changing our minds about the same things and regretting our actions and choices with respect to these things, large and small. The art of measurement, in contrast, this is the thing that he's arguing for in the Protagoras, would make the appearances lose their power by showing us the truth, would give us peace of mind, and would save our life. So changing our minds contrasts with having peace of mind, and regretting our actions and choices contrasts with having our life saved. The problem with changing your mind is you don't have peace of mind, and the problem with regretting your decisions is that you are not living your life. Okay, changing your mind, that's about being able to decide which is better and which isn't. So this comparable, non-comparable dimension is the dimension of choice. It's the dimension of practical deliberation, figuring out what should I do by weighing the values at stake. So that's comparability. The other dimension, regretting our actions versus saving our life, that's a dimension of regret, and that's got to do with compatibility and incompatibility. So regret is what happens when no matter what you do, you lose. Right? No matter what you do, you lose. That's different from choosing the better over the worse, which is good, and not choosing the worse over the better. That's the bad thing, right? So the dimension of choice and the dimension of regret are independent dimensions. Okay, so I think that in this passage, we see a distinction being drawn between comparability, the dimension of choice, and incompatibility, the dimension of what I'm calling regret here. Okay, I'm going to come back to this when we get to pluralism, where things are kind of harder to see. The last feature that I think that monists see as an attractive feature of their monism is that it means that we're all in it together. So this is engagement rather than respect. So these concepts, engagement and respect, come from the work of the political philosopher Joseph Raz. Died a couple of years ago, is that right? Do you remember Gonzalo? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, a couple of years ago. He contrasts in being engaged in a value practice with respect for a value practice. So engagement is being a member of the practice, an insider, and acting on the values, realizing the values or responding to the values by acting in some way. So that's engagement. So if you're into the blues, then maybe you play blues guitar and you collect blues records and you read books about the blues and you dream in the blues. You're engaged, right? If you're not into the blues, then you're not engaged. So there are blues values over there, but it's not your cup of tea. You can hear the music, but you don't, and maybe you kind of get a bit of it, but you don't really get all of it, right? And I think I argue that is an opportunity for respect. And according to Raz, respect is not just, I am human, you are human, therefore I respect you, I respect human dignity. That's thin, and that's not what Raz believes that exists. But he thinks that there's a richer, more robust respect phenomenon that he thinks is quite important, and I agree with him. So you're not into the blues, but you're into soul. You understand how the soul scene works in like 1974 New York City. You know all the main players and what was going on and how people were responding to each other, and you've got a big collection of records and so on. And you start to listen to like Chicago blues from the 1970s. And it's still not your cup of tea, but you have there's enough overlap between the two traditions that you could say, oh, I understand why that Stevie Wonder riff works for somebody in that tradition, even if it doesn't work for me in my tradition. It is reason giving for them in the same way as something in 1970s soul is reason giving for me. Respect requires that you be engaged somewhere. So you have an aesthetic center, there's an aesthetic world that you belong to. And it says you can have a knowing appreciation short of engagement for what's going on somewhere else. Okay? So that it's not a thin, I just respect human dignity. It's an understanding of the other, right? So that's cool if we're able to do that in aesthetic life. So there's no possibility for respect but that's just because we're all in the same thing together. There's just one world of beauty or one world of art, and we're all in that world. And this means that there's no regret. There's nothing we ever lose out on. Okay, so this is I think the image of aesthetic value monism that nicely describes Plato, and I think also other figures, the figures that we discussed in the reading group are Shaftesbury and Hegel. But I think it generalizes. I kind of have a hunch it generalizes, and if you think I'm wrong about that, I'd love to hear maybe some exceptions to my generalization. Okay, so if you look at the chart, then we have monism here. I'm leaving out validity, and so I just want to focus on comparability and compatibility for now. So monism sits right there. I don't know. Here's something. I don't know what to say about that possibility. So any thoughts you have there, I would love to hear them so I can steal them. Okay, so what about pluralism? Okay, so pluralists think there isn't one fundamental value, beauty or pleasure or anything like that. All of the aesthetic values are fundamental. They're all fundamental. So they all might be grounded in something, but what they're grounded in is not other values. They're grounded in things like having red paint on them or being in the key of B minor, right? So they're grounded in non-evaluative features of the world. They're not grounded in some more fundamental value. So pluralists say there are lots and lots and lots of fundamental aesthetic values. All the aesthetic values are fundamental. They don't boil down to one thing, to beauty or pleasure or anything like that. They have local validity. So once we see that there are all of these values, then we need to like give them some kind of structure. And so pluralists have typically appealed to in the Zhuangzi, it will be perspectives. For me, in my work, I call it aesthetic profiles. So there's groupings of values that are the values for a group of people, like soul values versus blues values. Soul values and blues values are two different groups of values. We're going to take all the zillions of values in the world and see that the values are values for people who are engaged in different walks of aesthetic life. That's the idea. So the soul values are reason giving for the soul people, soul engaged people, and the blues values are reason giving for the blues engaged people. Okay, they're non-comparable. This seems to be non-controversial so far. I haven't had anybody come up to me yet and say, I'm a pluralist, but I think the values are comparable. So I'm feeling okay about this one. So the idea is, there's no answer to the question whether A is better than B, or B is better than A, or they're equal in value. So aesthetic values are non-comparable. It's not the case that for any two aesthetic values, either one is better than the other, or they have the same value. So if you ask me what's better, a Muddy Waters guitar riff or a Stevie Wonder groove, I'll say that's a nonsensical question, because these are different aesthetic practices. It's like, I think my slide was hockey versus soccer. What's better, a strike by Ronaldo or a wrist shot by Haley Wickenheiser? And I think there's no good answer to that question. I mean, you can't say that Ronaldo's strike is better soccer, football, than Wickenheiser's wrist shot. That's silly. And you can't say, oh, the way he kicks that ball is just no good. He would never get the puck in the net. That's silly too, right? So the values aren't comparable because they aren't to be compared. Attempts to compare them are just silly. That's the thought. So that's putting all the pluralists on the bottom row of the chart, if you agree with me there. Okay, so this is where things get, there's a handout, and maybe if you could double up, that would be, I think there's some people who can't, sorry, but so, should have made more copies, Gonzalo, we predicted incorrectly. Did you, is there an extra? Okay. Oh, no, that's okay. You're sending it to Gamora? Okay, yeah. Okay, so hopefully so far everything that I've been saying has been pretty straightforward. You haven't jumped in to rattle my cage, so I'm going to infer from that it has been. Things get a little bit trickier with compatibility. This is where I'm getting pushback. Oh, thank you so much. Okay. I've been assuming that aesthetic values are compatible. So here's my picture. My picture, it's possible to realize all the aesthetic values in principle, in the sense that, okay, I've been using metaphors. I've been saying things like, the values don't speak against each other. Look, moral values aren't like this. So my favorite example is the honor code of the medieval samurai, the Bushido, and the Gandhian Martin Luther King conception of satyagraha. These are two visions of ethical life, and they speak against each other. If one is right, the other is wrong. You cannot coherently subscribe to both. You cannot coherently try to live by both. So these are the kinds of things that I've been saying. And it sort of worked because nobody's been pushing back on compatibility. So we could use a sports example. You can be a football fan, I'm sure you all are, and you can say, football, there should be lots of football in the world. And you cannot care at all about hockey, but you can still say, hockey, yes, there should be lots of hockey in the world too, just leave it in Canada, right? Your affiliation with football does not put you in a position of having to denigrate hockey. Just like my growing up, coming home from school and strapping on the skates and then going down to the park and playing hockey on the ice does not mean I hold anything against football, except that there's not enough goals scored. So I'm joking, right? Just to like illustrate the point that you can have both values. Now, does this mean there's no opportunity for regret? No, of course it doesn't mean there's no opportunity for regret. There's two kinds of regret that are possible when values are compatible. Firstly, we couldn't have the maximum possible amount of football in the world and the maximum possible amount of hockey in the world and the maximum possible amount of bobsled in the world, you know, Winter Olympics, bobsled, with unlimited resources. Resources are limited, we have to compete for the resources, and competition means some people are going to get more than others. And that's sad. And that's to be regretted. So there's that kind of regret. Regret due to limited resources, obviously, right? And that's like on a worldwide scale. There's also personal regret. So, I don't know, sometimes I think, I should have listened to my father and gone to medical school, right? We all have these kinds of thoughts. I chose a path in life, and by choosing that path, I foreclosed on other paths, and so I couldn't live every possible life that I could have lived. Right? That's just not in the cards. Human beings are not built that way. So there's that personal kind of regret is a form of regret. That's true even for compatible values. Maybe there's a young child somewhere who's desperately trying to make a decision, hockey or soccer, and she's going to have to choose. And then she might regret her choice. Even though she thinks it's her best choice, she could regret the loss. Okay, so those kinds of regrets are possible. So they're possible, they're compatible with values being, they are consistent with values being compatible with each other. All right, this idea of pluralism, where pluralism is a pluralism, I'm going to call it happy pluralism. You can be unhappy, but not in a principled way, which I'll get to in a second. This happy pluralism is kind of, it's what I have in mind. And I was always aware that there are some unhappy pluralists. They're unhappy because they think the values are in principle incompatible, not just in practice incompatible, not incompatible due to restricted resources, time, money, space, and possible lives to live, but they're compatible given their nature as values. So in the 20th century, pluralists were unhappy pluralists. The most famous example of this is Isaiah Berlin. So here's a passage. He says, certain ultimate values, this is right after the Plato, certain ultimate values are in principle and not merely in practice incompatible. Complete liberty is not compatible with complete equality. And this comes in a piece where he's articulating his commitment to pluralism. So he's an unhappy pluralist. Liberty sounds good, equality sounds good. You can't have maximal amounts of both in principle, not just as a matter of resources, but in principle. I'm not sure, Berlin is not super rigorous. It's not always clear that he's distinguishing compatibility and comparability. And this is also true among some of his followers. So here's a passage from Thomas Nagel, Fragmentation of Value, written around the same time. He says there's conflict between values which are incomparable for reasons apart from uncertainty about the facts. Okay, uncertainty about the facts, that might be suggesting, that's incomparability. Yeah. We're unable to bring them together in a single evaluative judgment. That could be about comparability, but it could be about incompatibility. Here's another quote. Human beings are complex creatures who can view the world from many perspectives. Each perspective presents a different set of claims. This sounds more like incompatibility. So here's Nagel's list of incompatible values. He says, this is near the top, obligations. We could take a perspective on the world when we're thinking about the obligations that we have. When we think about the obligations that we have, we realize that that they guide us in our action. We could take another perspective on the world in which we think about the rights that people have. And when we take a perspective in which we think about people's rights, that can give us different guidance on what to do. We could take a utilitarian perspective, a perfectionist perspective, where we think about maximizing great human achievements, such as sports or knowledge or philosophy. And we can take the perspective in which we live our personal lives, where our own personal projects that distinguish us from other people matter a lot to us, right? So the things that you're into matter to you partly because you're into them. Partly because, not entirely because, but partly because you're into them. And that amplifies their value. So here are 5 perspectives. And I think in these 2 passages, Nagel is saying that the values across these perspectives are incomparable. And he's saying that they're incompatible. So when he thinks that, to fully live your life from a personal perspective where you're valuing your own projects, you might have to maybe cut some corners when it comes to the rights of those around you. And he thinks that this is just a tragic part of the human condition, the tragic portion of the human condition. So notice that reference to perspectives, that's typically pluralist. There's going to be multiple perspectives that we can take on value, or what I call profiles, and they make the values incomparable, but they might also make them incompatible. Okay, so people have been writing things in response to aesthetic injustice saying, what? Lopez thinks pluralism is happy? We can all have our cake and eat it too, not in practice, but in principle. But it's all conflict. it's all agonism, or there's a big element of conflict, a big element of agonism, and they can't be eliminated. They're there, they're part of the picture. And so under the force of this pushback, and given some things that were said in the first 2 workshops and in the reading group, I'm realizing I really need to think more about this compatible, happy versus unhappy pluralism. I think my arguments for my account of aesthetic value imply happy pluralism. If my arguments are sound, happy pluralism is true, but it doesn't follow from that that others are happy pluralists. So there could be lots of unhappy pluralists around, including in the historical record. So I've been trying to think about a better way to understand what incompatibility comes down to than this metaphor of values speaking. Values don't speak. Values can't speak, right? They're properties. They don't speak. They have no voices. They have no capacity to speak. So what do I mean when I say that values speak against each other? Do I mean that they contradict each other? Not exactly. That can't be right. That's the wrong way to think about it. So here's a bit from Berlin, and maybe this is the idea that we need. So if ultimate values were not in principle compatible, the notion of a perfect world, however conceived, in which all true values are combined or perhaps mutually entailed, must be false. Okay, let's leave out the mutually entailed. That's way too strong. So let's just focus on combined, and let's take let's take the contrapositive of that conditional. Okay, so values are compatible if they can be combined in a perfect world. Right, that's a more straightforward way of putting it in English. Here's our criterion for compatibility. If you can have these values realized in a perfect world, then they're compatible. What would a perfect world be here, though? Okay, first of all, we want to be expressing in principle compatibility rather than in practice compatibility. So a perfect world is a world of unlimited resources. So don't get too happy, because that's not our world. So we can be in principle happy, but not in practice happy, pluralists. So first of all, the perfect world is a world in which we have unlimited resources. And secondly, I have to say, yeah, so the world is a perfect world where you have these 2 values, blues values and soul values it's a perfect world if you can have both of them without a loss at all. So let's just talk about goods. So you'll notice I say goods up here at the top. We're just talking about goods. So if you can have all of the soul goods and all of the blues goods and no loss of either kind of good, that's perfection. Okay, does that work with Bushido versus Satyagraha? Yes, it does. If you have all of the samurai values, you're undercutting the peaceful non-resistance, peaceful Satyagraha values, right? And if you have all the Satyagraha values, you're undercutting the Bushido values. So this seems to intuitively capture the difference between the ethical case and the aesthetic case. But we're appealing to this idea of a perfect world, which I don't love. This is not my preferred way to do things, because it's really hard to think about perfection. Like it's treacherous. And so it would be great if I could figure out a better way to more rigorously distinguish compatible from incompatible values without an appeal to a perfect world. Okay, let me just say one more thing, and then I guess we're going to default to two short bits with discussion in between. I think I mentioned at one of the workshops, the Alexander Nehamus thought experiment. So Alexander Nehamus is thinking about monism, and he says, some people dream of a world where we all share the same values. We all share the same values, universal validity, comparability, compatibility. And he says that's a nightmare. Okay, so some people, not everybody shares this, it's an intuition, right? I very strongly feel this intuition. I thought everybody would, but some people don't feel that intuition. They kind of say, what's wrong with the world where everybody shares the same values? They just don't. I think that the value of diversity is a fundamental value. Okay. I think Nehamus would say, hey, there's another dream. Some people dream of a world where there's locally valid, non-comparable, happily compatible values. And that genuinely is a dream. And that the unhappy version of pluralism is not a nightmare, but it's not a good dream either. Not a good dream either. It's kind of regrettable. So I think that this models a version, unhappy pluralism models regret. What monists and unhappy pluralists share in common is an interest in aesthetic life being a site where we don't have to regret clashes of value. We can regret in practice path-dependent choices, lack of resources, that kind of thing, but we can't regret that those other values exist because they undercut our values. That kind of regret isn't a possibility. Whereas unhappy pluralists do believe in that kind of regret. So this is another way of like seeing what the stakes are. All right, I'll stop there. So let's take a few minutes for discussion. I'm interested to hear any thoughts you might have or any aid that you might give me. And then we'll switch to Zhuangzi.
You want to conduct a discussion, or do you want?
I think if you'd like to do it, or I don't know.
As you wish. Otherwise, I'll just start making questions.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. That's really thought-provoking, Dom. Just perhaps start with a clarification question. You seem to invoke Nehamus a lot. I've read this book on Nietzsche. Nietzsche, Life as Literature.
Yeah.
And I recall this distinction between perspectivism and relativism. Basically saying that Nietzsche is not necessarily a relativist, he's a perspectivist, and what does that entail? What is perspectivism after all?
Okay.
So the fact of, even having like some sort of personal relation to truth, that is not speaking about objective truth in a foundationalist way, let's say, speaking about a truth that is a truth for me, like Kierkegaard, for instance, would have it, but not necessarily a truth in which everyone could recognize him or herself. I know this is tricky and slippery, but just clarification question. So perspectivism for you, a position in which we can see, I don't know, Nietzsche, some versions of hermeneutics, even Leibniz and Husserl at some point, let's say, this would be some sort of unhappy pluralism. Would that be it? What's the relation? So that's one question just to start.
No. So I think that all pluralists are committed to some kind of perspectivism, understood in the most capacious and broad way that you can imagine. Because there's going to be there's a whole range of differences. So for some of them, it will be like very metaphysical. For some of them, it will be epistemic, about access. What you can know, we just know different things. For some, it will be quite social. So in my case, what I think is that everything in the world has all the aesthetic values. So I'm a crazy liberal when it comes to attributing values. Like this marker is beautiful and it's ugly and it's charming and it's hilarious. It's just got all of these features. But it takes social practices in which we're coordinating to cooperate with each other to give us access to a set of values that each item has. Okay, so that's a metaphysical plenitude that's non-perspectival, with social practices carving out perspectives on the plenitude of the universe. And that's a happy pluralism. So I think that all the pluralists have to have some kind of perspective. Here's where maybe I think that all the pluralists, this is certainly true in the Berlin tradition, all the pluralists would distinguish themselves from subjectivists, right? So whatever the perspectives are, they're not merely individual. Yeah, they're something, but what more they are than the individual is something social or something metaphysical or something epistemic or something else. They're going to disagree on. So does that help? Yeah.
I don't know if I should continue thinking out loud, because that's just what I'm doing right now. So I haven't read the replies to aesthetic injustice, but I kind of also wonder whether you can really eliminate all agonism, even within the sphere of merely not in a pejorative way, aesthetic value. And I was thinking about, so the perfect world is some sort of thought experiment, I assume, in which there is no limitation of resources, etc. I was thinking about this. What kind of person would you have to be in order to experience, let's say, all the possible aesthetic values? It would have to be like some sort, you would have to be immortal, ubiquitous, you would have to have multiple selves.
Yes.
Right? So are you acquainted with the work of Álvaro de Campos?
Of who?
Álvaro, so Fernando Pessoa, the great Portuguese poet, the several heteronyms, right? Which were like literary persona you would embody. Actually, even act out, because it's more than pseudonyms. It's a different notion. But we can speak a little bit more about that if you're not acquainted with that. So one of his most famous heteronyms is called Álvaro de Campos. He's a metaphysician, deeply pessimistic, etc., and author of some of the best-known poems by Fernando Pessoa. And so he has a very famous poem called "To feel everything in every possible way, to see everything from every possible perspective." That's perhaps a cool embodiment, a cool example for the, I don't know, perfect world experiment. I don't know if I'm, just digressing, but it's just
good.
A comment. Actually,
so the perfect. This is going to be in Zhuangzi. Okay, but you can have a perfect world in which you have a perfect world in which all of the values are maximally realized, none undercutting the others. So they're all optimally realized, but they're not optimally realized for every individual in that world.
Final question or comment, and I'll shut up because I don't want to monopolize. But so when we were discussing the chapter on Hegel, you were saying that is maximally pluralist monist or something like that. I wonder if we could say about, I don't know if that was the exact expression. I don't remember.
Yeah.
I would say that you are maximally pluralist, period. Here's my question, though.
Yes.
I mean, does by itself every possible social practice understood in its function of aesthetic practice capable to foster a valid aesthetic value? And the aesthetic values virtually infinite, or what's your take on this?
What do you have in mind? Do you have a problem case in mind?
I'm just wondering, because how many aesthetic values can there be? Because a new game or a new form of social interaction can in itself bring about a new aesthetic value. You would admit that, wouldn't you?
So
is there a limit to this? Because
how many possible works of music are there? It's an indefinite number, right? And each of them has its own unique value. Because it's a mixture, it's a blend of values. Each work is a blend of values. It's unique in its aesthetic value. So even within one art form, there's an infinity of possible aesthetic values. And there's no reason to restrict ourselves to one art form. How many possible sites of aesthetic, how many sites are there in which aesthetic values are realized? Well, that's an indefinite number also.
So yeah.
Yeah. So okay, which is no problem until you say, and they're all fundamental. And then people lose it, right? Then they lose it. And they say, what? That's too many. They've got to be reducible to something. Because that's the way we make sense of the world, is by taking up many and reducing it to one.
And how to pass judgment cross-culturally, in a way that is not exactly context sensitive, etc. So all the problems.
Yeah.
But yeah, so summing up, aesthetic value is everywhere.
Aesthetic value is everywhere.
And it's multiple and potentially infinite, etc. You are a maximal perspectivist too.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
Okay.
Regina.
I wrote to be more able to understand what I was supposed to tell to us. Being aesthetics a sensitive experience by reason mediation, in which way a common values foundation can be considered for a constitutive plural aesthetics, and at the same time regarding the Popperian falsificability concept.
Okay, so I don't think that there are common values at the first order level. My pluralism is in fact a denial of that. There's nothing but a lot of difference. There's a lot of difference. It's organized difference because, so there's a lot of ways to understand the organization. I think of it in terms of social practices. Right? We are in social practices where these values come together. We have a vision of how they come together. Our shared vision of how they come together enables us to be in the blue sea with each other, or the soul sea, or whatever. It's only at a secondary reflective level where we have values like respect come in. And respect I do think of as a universal value. So anybody who's involved in aesthetic life, they have their thing that they're into. Their being into that thing gives them some appreciation of what it means for somebody else to be into a different thing. And that's the basis of respect. So, it's not exactly universal because there might be human beings who have no aesthetic home. They're not into anything. But almost every human being is. Yeah.
What do you think about considering the relation concept like a masterpiece to integrate the cultural relativity with respect, considering a common criterion and principles? Because when we talk about aesthetics, we are talking, I think, about a full experience being complements via to understanding.
Are you asking about whether masterpieces can serve as a touchstone?
Respect, like a piece to via to integrate cultural relativity, respect.
So I think respect implies perspective. There's no respect without difference in perspective. If we're all on the same page, we don't need respect because we're already playing the same game with each other. Respect is football for hockey, not within the football world. And I'm really skeptical of the idea of masterpieces. I think that within a practice, you can have your exemplar works. Stevie Wonder's Superstition. The groove in Superstition is the best groove in soul. It is just like, it tells you everything you need to know about how the groove works. So in a sense, you could say Superstition is, like, if you want to learn about the groove, you listen to that song. So in a sense, it's a masterwork, but that doesn't mean it has any appeal for anybody else outside that world of soul. I'm very suspicious of the idea that there are these special works that cut across boundaries. I was once hanging out with some friends and we were talking about this, and one of my friends, Samantha Mathern at Harvard, said, "Oh, there are these masterworks." And I said, "Give me an example." She said, "Homer." And I said, "You've got to be kidding. K-pop is a way better." Like, Homer is so remote from most 99%. With apologies to the classicists, 99% of people in the world struggle with Homer, right? It is not the common touchstone. K-pop is the common touchstone. And then Samantha said, "Yeah, so I don't mean it that way." Yeah, so if we're looking for touchstones, they're not going to be what you think they are. Seriously, I mean, honestly, they're not. They're just not. And then you realize, okay, so why are we looking for touchstones? What's going on with this? What's really going on here? We know the answer to that. Bourdieu told us. You want to hear about Zhuangzi? Okay, so this is chapter 1 is Plato. He's the arch monist. He's the most thoroughgoing, purebred monist. His standard, this is what the chapter's about, the standard that he puts on his theorizing is meant to establish some monist ideals, and that standard is extremely high. Socrates, in these two dialogues, Hippias Major and the Protagoras, cannot even meet his own epistemic standard. He gives up. Plato, later on by the time of the Republic, thinks that he can meet that standard. But Socrates fails his own standard. Okay, the Zhuangzi is the most, I think, pure and thoroughgoing form of pluralism. The Zhuangzi is a historical figure. He's a generation later than Plato. It's about 50 years later than Plato. So they're basically running around the same time, but this is the Warring States period in China. The text is complicated. It's definitely not written by a single author. Probably it's a good idea to think of it as an anthology. And it's very difficult for those of us trained in standard European philosophy to get into. And that's because of the way it's written. It's anecdotes. It's a whole series of anecdotes. But behind these anecdotes is very carefully worked out philosophy of language, which we now know about. Philosophy of language in this period in Warring States China was very advanced. And metaphysics, again, very advanced. It's there between the lines. Between the lines, but it would have been evident to Chinese readers at the time or Chinese students at the time, and it still is. And that's because these texts are never presented in their home context by themselves. They're always accompanied by layers and layers of commentary. And the commentary, so that you have this anecdote and then these commentators bringing out the background philosophy. It's only in the last 20 years that English translations, I don't know about Portuguese, English translations have included the commentaries. And so if you're interested in the Zhuangzi, I highly recommend the Zipporah translation. There's a new translation by Chris Fraser, which is just out, but I haven't seen it. But the Zipporah translation is the first translation of the Zhuangzi that includes commentary. And the commentary just really opens up the text to you. You can see what's going on when you read it side by side with the commentary. So you have to imagine that the text is read by a teacher with a bunch of students sitting around in a circle, right, in a study, and then they discuss it. And the commentary feeds into that discussion that they have. The zhuangzi is not, like the anecdotes, you can kind of often see the philosophical point, but the analects, you know, it sounds like fortune cookie phrases. Like that is really impossible to understand without the commentary. So I highly recommend the Slingerland translation of the Analects if you want a little bit of a taste of the Confucian tradition, because Slingerland, he's one of my colleagues at UBC, he includes the classic commentaries. Okay, so let's take a look at, here's some pluralism. I'm giving you a taste of something that's unfamiliar to you, maybe a little bit exotic. I thought it would be fun to do that. So these are all passages. It's an anthology, so there's passages that contradict these passages. Like there's later writers who are adding in competing viewpoints, but there is definitely a thread, a strong thread of pluralism throughout the zhuangzi. Here's an example. So let's just start at the second sentence. Humans regard Mao Qing and the imperial concubine Li as what is beautiful. But when fish see them, they dive to the deep water. When birds see them, they fly away in the skies. When deer see them, they gallop away resolutely. Of these four, does one know what is correctly attractive in the world? So there's an interpretation on which the issue here is epistemic, but the standard interpretation is one on which the issue is not epistemic. What the zhuangzi is doing here is proposing the idea of different aesthetic perspectives that creatures have because of their bodies and their environments that shape what they consider to be beautiful. So close to this passage, there's another passage which says that eels find slime and muck beautiful. They cozy up to the slimy, muddy nook under the water. Okay, so their perspectives. This is a kind of a familiar thought. Here's the second passage. Let's take the last sentence first. So there's, right at the end of the last sentence, there's this Tao, here capitalized. You could translate it as the way, I don't like I wrote this paper with a student. The student did these translations from ancient Chinese. So I don't love the capitalization, but the idea here is that there's two kinds of Taos. And one of them is the great Tao, Da. The Tao passes through them all, making them one. So there's the world that is all of the perspectives, the world that is all of the perspectives. It is a product of the small Taos, which are patterns of activity. So a path is a Tao. It's formed by walking. Things are so by being called. So here stands in for a predicate rather than a subject. From being so, they are so. If they're not so, it's from not being so. That's a result of the things that we do, the paths that we walk. Things have a place from which they're so. They have a place from which they're allowable. There's nothing that isn't a particular, doesn't have a particular property. There's nothing that, I lost myself. One deems something as having this property, picking out a sapling in comparison to a pillar, or something horrid in comparison to she, the great beauty, something excessive, deflective, misleading, bizarre. The Tao is the way of seeing them all. Okay, so we've got this first idea in the zhuangzi is multiple perspectives. Second idea is there's the conglomeration, the aggregation of them all. That's the great Tao. That's just the world in all its plenitude. Like that's the super duper pluralism that Gonzalo was talking about. It's usually about value. Even being a sapling compared to a pillar, size is a kind of value. What are these values? Here's, I think, a key passage in understanding the aesthetics of the Zhuangzi. It's about this woman who's imitating the great beauty. So she is kind of like Helen of Troy. She's just like, she's the stand-in for something beautiful. She just like trotted out as an example of beauty. So instead of saying the most beautiful thing in the world, but just say she. Once the heart of she was troubled, and she was glaring at people in her village. So she's got indigestion, and she's got this mean look on her face. An ugly woman of the village saw that and considered it beautiful. So she also started to hold her chest with both her hands and glare at people on her way home. When the rich men of the village saw that, they slammed the doors. When the poor men of the village saw that, they ran away because they had no doors to slam, so they ran away, taking their wives and children. The ugly woman knew that she's grimace was beautiful, but she didn't understand that by which. This is like that phrase in Plato, the by phrase, right? That by which, 所以 it was beautiful. Okay, so there's two mistakes that the imitator can be making. One mistake is this. She's in the village. There's the perspective of the villagers about what makes things beautiful, right? And she does not fully understand that perspective. She thinks that she's glaring makes she beautiful. But it's not she's glaring that makes her beautiful, it's something else that makes her beautiful. She doesn't understand what grounds beauty in that practice. Right, so that's a mistake. You might think that being in B minor makes a song happy in folk music, but it doesn't. You can make that mistake, right? You don't know how the modes work in folk music. Okay, so that's one mistake. Another mistake she can make is about what the perspective is. She thinks she's in a village where this perspective makes glaring she beautiful. And she's not in that village. There's a neighboring village where the glaring makes for beauty, but that's not the village she's in. So she doesn't make a mistake about what grounds beauty in that practice. She makes a mistake about what the practice is, what the profile is. And I think that there are other passages where it's clear in the Zhuangzi that both mistakes are possible. So here we can understand perspectives in just the way I do in, like when I read this, I thought, oh my God, I've been scooped by 2,500 years. Perspectives are just patterns of grounding of values. There are different ways of grounding values in different social practices, or in the case of the Zhuangzi, there are different grounds for value in different perspectives that people take on. Right. Like Plato's aesthetics, we were talking about this, it's pre-modern in the sense that it does not make the assumption, does not take as obvious the assumption that aesthetic values are not practical values, that aesthetic life and practical life are insulated from each other. On the contrary, the ancient Greeks thought that there was an intimate connection between aesthetic values and practical values. To know what's beautiful is to know how to operate well in the world and therefore live a good life. To live a good life isn't to have some stuff in your head, it's to live your life by choosing actions. That's why choice of action is so important for Plato. Right? You need to decide what to do. And in deciding what to do, beauty figures. It's actually indistinguishable from the good. The same is true in the Zhuangzi. So this is a great set of comparisons. The same is true in the Zhuangzi. So aesthetic value figures in agency. There's two kinds of agents in the Zhuangzi. Now we're going to get to Gonzalo's question. There's it's usually the Shenren. The Shenren is the utmost person, the ideal person. Here's the next passage. The utmost person, or the Jiren, is the person who attains utmost beauty, Jimei, utmost joy. Attaining these makes the ideal person an ideal person. What's utmost beauty? Utmost beauty is the capacity to appreciate all the beauties of the great Tao. So remember, I began by distinguishing the great Tao from the small Taos? The great Tao is everything. So the utmost person somehow tunes in everything. Okay, these utmost people show up in the Zhuangzi and in the Tao Te Ching, and they're not human beings. They're not human beings. They can take on any form. They fly through the skies. They're not like you and me. So to really appreciate everything, you have to be non-human. You're kind of an ideal, but you're a non-human ideal. And what you're able to do is like nimbly negotiate all of the possible ways the world can be. What's so great about this? Well, it means you're never caught on the back foot. You're always able to act well. So here's this passage. The myriad things. One might think what is beautiful is the sacred and the wondrous, and then what is awful is the fetid and rotten. But the fetid and rotten reverts and transforms into the sacred and wondrous. The sacred and wondrous reverts and transforms into the fetid and rotten. For this reason, it said, listen to the qi that permeates the world. This is what the Shengren, the sacred person, values. Oneness. Okay, so the world is constantly in flux, constantly changing. You can't pin it down. The only way you can really purely live well is to go with that flux, to go with that flow. And that's not possible for you and I. We could not have our bodies, remember? The eel in its nook, the fish and the beauty of Shishi, right? Our perspectives are determined by our bodies and our ecological perspectives. And for the Confucians, they will say your social perspective, and so the Zhuangzi says, yes, and your social perspective too, but don't let that be fixed. So to live a good life, you need to cope with a changing world no matter how it changes. And that means you have to be ultimately flexible. But that's not within the ken of human beings, ordinary human beings like you and I. So what can we do? Well, there's another kind of ideal. This is the Zhe-ren. The word Zhe means virtue. It means charm. It means beauty. It's what a leader has who's able to bring peace and prosperity and foment loyalty. So it's virtue, the virtuous person. And there are two nice examples of how the virtuous person acts aesthetically in the Zhuangzi, and I've given you one here, and I'll tell you about the other. So the first is butcher ding. So shuk, the meat swiftly torn from the bones would echo. Whoosh, the rhythmic movement of the blade, never failing to be perfectly attuned. Blending in the Mulberry Grove dance, and in fact, perfectly consonant with the Jingzhou melody. So you have a butcher who's butchering an ox and dancing and singing. This is the perfect butcher. Why is this the perfect butcher? He never dulls his blade. Every ox is different, but he just goes through the ox, through the gaps in the molecules, never hitting a molecule, right? He knows where to go so that the there's no resistance. So that's perfect action. That's the image of perfect action. So this is a conversation between Butcher Ding and this king, and the king says, what makes us so great? And he responds, a good butcher changing his knife every year is cutting. An average butcher changing his blade once a month is hacking. The hacker is you or I. The cutter is the Confucian ideal person, the zhengzi. He says, I've now been using my knife for 19 years, dismembering oxen in thousands, but the blade of my knife is still as if it just came off the whetstone. Okay, woodcarver Ching. Woodcarver Ching is asked by another king, why are you such a good woodcarver? And he says, here's what I do. First I wander in the forest, and and I'm looking at the trees, and I find the tree, and I can see the, it's a gong stand. So they have these gongs and a stand. I can see the gong stand, what gong stand is in that wood ready to come out, okay? So then when I see that, then I'll cut down that tree. And then he says, oh, actually, maybe I'll read this to you. Why not? So this is like the practical advice that we get. He says, okay, now I've got the tree, I'm ready to begin carving. I fast in order to quiet the mind. Having fasted for 3 days, I don't dare anymore to be concerned about being complimented or praised by people, nor about social rank or salary. Having fasted for 5 days, I don't dare anymore to be concerned about public regard, nor about skill or ineptitude. Having fasted for 7 days, I always forget that I have 4 limbs in a material body. At that moment, there's no more thought of lords or courts. My skill is the only thing I'm focused on, and everything external disappears. So the point of this story is, to be an ideal agent, you cannot be stuck in the perspectives that are familiar to you, right? You've got to be able to move between perspectives. Find this perspective that fits the circumstances, right? So how do you do that? You need to loosen the grip of your inculcated thinking on your mind. And so there's a kind of a meditative process that does that. And it basically suspends the social structuring of thought to loosen you up enough that maybe you can't get the perspective of the eel who regards the slimy nook under the water as cozy, but you can get a perspective on which now you can see exactly how to carve this tree to make that bell stand, that gong stand. So that's what's possible for human beings. So perspectivism, this metaphysical idea that all the perspectives constitute the world. The recognition that what matters for us is living our lives well, which means choosing how to act. And then the lesson that to do that, we cannot allow the perspectives we've inherited to be the ones that govern us. We have to sometimes need to move between perspectives. So classical Taoist social critique of the straitjacketed Confucian, who says, this is passages in the Analects where it says, you can listen to this kind of music, not to that kind of music. That kind of music is just depraved. Don't listen to it. That's what you get in the Analects. And then Zhuangzi is, no. Let's be hippies, let's let it all hang out. In doing that, we're going to be able to be more nimble and fluid. There's a literature in which this is related to spontaneity and adaptivity. Adaptivity is not being locked in by habit. Spontaneity is not planning too much. So basically, the Zhuangzi is saying, good agents are spontaneous and adaptive, not locked in by habit, not planners, because planning requires preconception. And your preconceptions might not fit the circumstances of the case. Okay, so there's a little taste of a figure running around the same time as Plato, but with a pluralist account of aesthetic value, quite unlike that monist account that we get in Plato. And it's kind of fun to grapple with these texts. The Zhuangzi is just funny and irreverent. There are passages where you just are laughing, even 2,500 years later. It's unusual for jokes to make it that long. So there's something, I do recommend it to you. Okay, I'll stop there. We have about 15 minutes for questions or thoughts.
I have 2 questions, and I would like to state the 2 questions because they are related and
Yeah.
The first is, considering Nietzschean approach on different perspectives and also the Tao's systematic dispositions, what's your underground understanding about human cultural being and notions, the notion human cultural being and the Superman concept?
I cannot comment on Nietzsche. I really can't. I don't know it well
I
enough.
think the second one is
Yeah.
Aristotle, in his analytical exercise, speaks about 2 mental types on acknowledged movement process, passivity and activity. How do you articulate with gender, culture, and poetics concepts?
Not sure what you're asking. So, gender, culture, these,
Aesthetics?
yeah,
We are talking about I prefer to call it plural aesthetics.
yeah.
And it connects us to the principal concept that is cultural. And because of the discussion at my 2 first questions, the relativity about respecting different cultures, I remember Aristotle in his analysis about acknowledged movement process and the 2 types of dispositions, like in Tao, systematic analysis, passivity and activity. And because we are talking about culture, I would like to know what you think about these when you consider the gender concept, cultural concept, and poetics concept. Because aesthetics are at the final poetics, poetry.
Okay, I don't.
Determination.
Yes. Okay. Good. So I don't have a general theory of culture, and I don't. So I've written on the aesthetic practices that impact on gender and aesthetic practices that are constituted by gender. That's not gendered in general. Right? Actually, in Aesthetic Injustice, in the chapter on beauty ideals, it deals with gender and race, and it surveys the literature on gender and race while remaining neutral about the various options. And I guess I have a bit of a leaning towards some views and against others, but I really am kind of on the fence. If you ask me what gender is or what race is, I'm not really sure. Hotly debated, and I don't have enough skin in the game to feel that I need to take a position. So what I do need to have is a way of understanding how race and gender, whatever they are, impact aesthetic life and how they're impacted by it. And there's a lot to say there on the good side and the bad side of both of them. And the good side in the sense that most importantly, there are sources of resistance in aesthetic life. Aesthetic life is not just burdening us. It's also giving us sources to resist things that are not good. And I think it's important to be able to tap those resources. And to tap those resources, you have to see that they're there. Yeah. Does that help? Yes. Okay. Yes.
I would also like to ask a couple of questions. Just if you can clarify a little bit, what do you mean by that? Perfect words where all the aesthetic values can function at the same time without contradicting each other, because at least my interpretation goes to the following scene. Imagine when we are talking about God, the argument that God is the best thing you can think about, is the most powerful thought, so it necessarily has to exist because perfection implies being an entire being. And that's kind of, in my opinion and my judgment, redundant, because it's saying God exists because it's perfect, and it's perfect, so therefore it exists. And I think it's saying that for all the aesthetic values to be multi-control and also comfortable with each other, they have to exist at the same time at this perfect world. Okay, but what is a perfect world? It's a world where all the aesthetic values. Do you understand what I mean? It's kind of, I'm not saying contradicting each other, but kind of not giving properly an explanation to what is this perfect world.
Would it help if I said the perfect world would be one like this?
Like the one we are in now?
One that where the values are maximally realized, all the values are maximally realized. So realizing one kind of value does not impose a cost on another kind of value. So I don't think the perfect world exists, obviously. And so I'm not at all moved by some kind of ontological argument. So I'm just imagining what it would be if what features would make it perfect were to exist. But it doesn't need to exist. It just needs to give me a way of thinking about what compatibility is.
So that compatibility would only be possible in a world that is not our world, so in our life, that it's really not the case. So what I mean is, in theory, we can have that, but in reality, that's not really possible. At least that's the understanding I make. Is this correct?
Okay, yes, good. So I think that once you see that values are compatible in the perfect world, then they're compatible in our world. They're compatible in our world. So if you grant that in a perfect world, omniscience is good, then omniscience is good, period. Although in our world, sometimes knowing too much, like if you really know everything, your life is a drag, right? So in our world, omniscience is good, but there are reasons not to be omniscient. Does that help? Yeah. Okay, I think I understand your point. Like maybe I need to think about what follows from the fact that values are incompatible in a perfect world. You're challenging me on that. Yeah, you're challenging me on that. So I get it. Yes, so I'll think more about that. That is helpful. Yeah. Like maybe there are interactions in principle, not just due to resources, limited resources, path dependence. Good. Yeah. Thanks. Did you have your hand?
Sorry,
I'm not, my area is not philosophy, so maybe my question is basic.
Excellent.
And maybe you talked about this, but I didn't understand. So we talked about how it can be compatible in a perfect world, but how it can be compatible in our world. So my question is, how can these values be compatible with each other in our reality, which is not perfect?
Yeah. So the idea here is, okay, so the idea here is we ask, are values compatible? That sounds like it's asking, can we have it all? Right. And then the problem is we say, obviously we can't have it all, right? Because we have limited time, each of us only has one life to live, there's limited resources, we can't have it all. And then the response says, yes, but that's noise. That's just noise in the picture. When we say that values are compatible, we're saying that they're compatible in principle, if they're not compatible in practice. In practice, they're not compatible because there's this noise, there's lack of resources, there's path dependence, there's all of these things that's making it so that we can't have it all. But in principle, and the thought is, in principle, we can have it all. But then what does in principle mean there? So that's the phrase that Berlin uses, in principle, incompatible. And then then I'm taking him as hinting at understanding in principle in terms of a perfect world. So they're in principle compatible if they're compatible when issues of resources are taken off the table. When path dependency is taken off the table, they're bracketed, as it were, right? They're bracketed. We're saying they're not relevant variables. They're not relevant variables. So let's focus on the relevant variables. So what would it be to focus on the relevant variables? Well, let's just say in a perfect world, there's no issue of resources, resource limitations, and there's no path dependence. Now, maybe this doesn't really add anything. Maybe this is just another metaphor that's not helping. So I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with the way to characterize compatibility that the happy and the sad pluralists can both agree on.
But in practice, they're always incompatible, right?
In practice, okay, yes, they're always incompatible. Sometimes the incompatibility is, it's right there in front of us and it's shaping our lives, right? So you will have choices in your life that you have to make where you have to choose A or B and you can't have both, right? And sometimes, like when it comes to hockey versus soccer, we can get a lot of both of them. We have a lot of both of them, right? So there it doesn't feel like it's a tragedy. That if you think those are incompatible, it's not a tragic incompatibility. Or if you think there's a choice between them, there's very little, at a worldwide level. Maybe in individual lives, yes. But in terms just of resources in the world, no. So yeah, there's degrees of, if you think the values are incompatible in practice, that's a matter of degree. I think maybe, yeah.
It's nothing to do with what I was asking, but we are getting to the Spinoza-Hegel question. Every determination is negation, and so maybe in practice there. I was just wondering, I'm not sure whether this is a question about you or drunk you. I guess I was trying to think, how well do your perspectives match? That is, how well does your perspective match that of the drunk group? Because coming back to our earlier discussion about Michael Walzer and several paths for moral criticism, you know, how do we, what's our relation with values? Do we make them up? Do we discover them, etc.? So for Jean, this would be discovery, right? Because I mean, if I got it right,
yeah.
because at some point his account, I mean, the account of virtue, and so we have to be flexible, etc. So I was thinking, where do values come from? They can come from several aesthetic practices, but then the source would be social. And for Jean, if I got this right, it's not that, because actually society can bear like a negative influence upon you and prevent you from acquiring virtue, because it is conditioning your adaptability, your flexibility. It's like closing up your perspective on what comes down from, you know, tradition and social sources. Let's say, if I got it right. So the attunement that we need for Jean, it's like a metaphysical attunement with nature. Like, forget about the usual ways of looking at things and be like the tree, or be like the snake, or be like whatever. I got this right?
Yeah, it's
Bruce Lee, I got this right, I guess. But that's not your perspective, is it?
No. So you're right that there's the. So there's two things. So there's the Shengren who's able to tune in the great Tao. That those beings don't exist. Then there's the Jiren. That's a humanly achievable ideal. And the humanly achievable ideal, I think, for the Zhuangzi is it's pretty antisocial. It's pretty like it's pretty the Zhuang does not have a high opinion of social imposition. However, the great Tao is a product of walking the small Taos, right? So it's not that all. So the Shengren sees all the possible ways of walking, but for us, there are the human ways of walking that give us human possibilities. So I think there's a bit of a balance, but the balance is more on the side of opposing social constraint. So a beautiful way this comes out is in the description of the beauty of disabled bodies. The most beautiful bodies are disabled bodies. So grieving camelback startles the world with his awfulness, yet he exemplifies virtuosity. Master Underling's back was coming out all crooked and bended to the point that his 5 organs were at the top. His chin was in his navel. His shoulders were higher than his head. But when he asked whether he objects, he replies that if his left arm became a rooster, I would adapt and use it to invoke the dawn. So it's these. So it's even saying like what you might think is the most innate part of human nature, which is our responses to the beauty of bodies, even that should be challenged. Yeah. So, yes, I think you're right. Whereas I'm a social constructivist, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So walking the Tao is a kind of sociality, but it's far more minimal than anything that I think works. So there's a difference there.
I guess you would have a final question, but I don't know if we should stop. I'll let you be the judge.
I think we should probably stop because people need to move on, but you and I could. Yep. Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you were able to attend this, and I hope you've profited from it. If you have any thoughts you'd like to communicate with me, Google me, you'll find my email address. You're welcome to send me emails.
Thank you.
Doesn't seem to work.